know, he sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's traveled to the region numerous times just in the last few months. Senator, you and I have had lots of conversation about Ukraine. Welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thanks, Chuck.
Let me start with the president's remarks yesterday, an apparent ad lib. But it's a question I think I asked you on this. You know, can this end with Putin in power? And what did you make of the president's remarks?
Well, first, I think all of us believe the world would be a better place without Vladimir Putin. But second, that's not the official U.S. policy. And by saying that regime change is our strategy, effectively, it plays into the hands of the Russian propagandists and plays into the hands of Vladimir Putin. So it was a mistake, and the president recognized that, and the White House has walked it back. By the way, they had to walk back 3 other comments he made as well. But look, we're in a crisis. We're in a war situation, and so clarity is incredibly important, and we need to be sure that we are also clear with our NATO allies, because that's how we are stronger. President
Zelensky heard all of this week, and he just says for him it's still talk. And I understand that he's in the middle of this war. He's watching innocent people get attacked and die. He wants some planes. He wants this this ability to do a no-fly zone. Any movement in your head on this?
Well, I think President Zelensky is correct. I thought the president's speech was very strong, despite the ad lib at the end, the gaffe at the end. But it was a powerful speech that does not match the action. So there was a mismatch between the rhetoric and what we're actually doing. And that's the issue. And that's what President Zelensky was talking about. Because there are additional weapons that they're desperately needing that we are not yet providing, particularly any anti-air systems and more munitions for their own anti-air systems. But also they're asking for anti-tank systems. They're asking for more anti-ship systems, which is really important right now because some of these missiles are coming from the Black Sea. They've asked for help across the board that is not yet there, and that's what President Zelensky is talking about. So we need to do more. We need to do it more quickly. We did send some Soviet-era anti-aircraft systems, I'm told, recently, at least based on public reporting, or at least it's on its way. But there are other systems that are more powerful, the S-300 in particular, that we have not sent. And we have that because we had acquired it at one point to be able to test it against our planes and so on. We should send that. We should do everything we can do to facilitate these other countries that have these Warsaw Pact era, Soviet systems into Ukraine, because that's what they desperately need, Chuck. And that's what the president's been asking for. We should also send the MiG-29s to raise that issue again. It's been a few weeks now since the Secretary of State gave that a green light, and somehow that hasn't happened. And the Ukrainians insist that they need it, they want it, it would be helpful. I think we need to trust them on that.
You heard the ambassador. Does phosphorus, the use of some phosphorus bombs to you, cross that line on the use of chemical weapons to change NATO's calculus or not?
Well, if we can verify it, I think it is. I think the use of chemical weapons against innocent civilians is something where we have to draw a red line, and we need to do it now, and we need to do it with our NATO allies. Recall we did this in Syria and did not honor the red line. This time we got to be darn sure that what we're doing is something that will be backed up by us, by our NATO allies. And I do think that's a red line. I think chemical and biological weapons must be.
Do you believe the response, I hear the words proportionate. Define what proportionate in your mind would be.
Well, the president said that we would respond in kind, and later that was walked back because it sounded like he was saying, of course, we would respond with chemical weapons, which would not be appropriate. We've actually signed a treaty saying we would never do that, as has Russia, by the way. So our response should be militarily. And I don't think we need to spell it out exactly, but there are a number of military responses that I could see. One would be to establish a humanitarian air defense zone in parts of western Ukraine. And that could be done from outside of the borders of Ukraine. That's an example where in Lviv, where you have thousands of people who are there with the international relief organizations, lots of reporters, including from NBC, lots of refugees coming through, hundreds of thousands there. Yesterday, there was a bombing of Lviv within a couple miles of the train station where there's so many refugees and so many of these Westerners. So we could, through some means, since we have Patriot missiles in Poland, in Romania, in Slovakia, protect some of that territory. That's an example of something that could be done militarily that would not be offensive, strictly defensive, no boots on the ground, but would enable us to say use of chemical weapons or biological weapons has consequences, and we're going to do something about it.
Let me turn to some domestic issues here. The Supreme Court. Have you made a decision on whether you're going to support Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's elevation to the Supreme Court?
Well, I said all along I'm going to wait till the Judiciary Committee is done with its action. I think they're going to vote a week from Monday. They've still asked for additional documents, the Republicans on the committee, so I want to give her that ability. But as you know, Chuck, less than a year ago I voted against her for the Court of Appeals, and I did so because I'm concerned about her judicial philosophy. In particular, for me, on the regulatory front, she had a case at the district court level where essentially she legislated from the bench and had to do with country of origin labeling for meat products, and she did what many of us think is wrong, which is say that the statute says one thing, but we're going to, as judges, decide what's best. And so that's my biggest concern. I talked to her about it. I've also talked to her about the court packing issue, which does concern me. Her mentor, Justice Breyer, as well as Justice Ginsburg, both came out against packing the court because of the interest in defending the institution of the court, and yet she refuses to do that. And I don't understand that because it's not an issue that will come before her in the court, so she should, as a nominee, be able to talk about it, and I'm concerned that she's not been willing to do that.
I'm curious, I want to play a clip of some of the questioning she received from some of your Republican colleagues on the committee hearing. Here's the clip.
You say this does not signal a heinous or egregious child pornography offense. Help me understand that.
Do you agree with this book that is being taught with kids that babies are racist?
The ordinary crime was not committed by computer. So the
Would you now agree with me that computers are sort of the venue of choice for child pornographer people?
Senator Mitt Romney thought some of the tone of the questioning and the topics were sort of off key there. I'm curious what you thought.
Well, her record is fair game, Chuck, and this is not attacking her personally. By the way, I found her bright and personable when I met with her. She's obviously an historic choice for the court, but I don't think it's wrong to go after her record. I mean, that's what we should be doing in these hearings. With Justice Kavanaugh, as you know, it became personal attacks. By the way, uncorroborated attacks. It was not about his record, largely. This is about her record, and it's about her sentencing. It's not probably what I'm going to base my decision on, because I think there are a lot of judges that have very lenient sentencing these days. I do think at a time of rising crime, particularly in our major cities, that's an issue. And she was below the recommendations based on the federal sentencing guidelines, and also below, in some cases, what the probation officers recommended. So I think it's fair to ask about that. I think it should be done in a respectful way. And again, I'm glad that these were not personal attacks on her, which we have seen in previous
And Senator, I'm curious,
nominations, including Judge Kavanaugh.
I'm curious if you believe Justice Thomas, these text messages that have come out from Ginny Thomas to the former White House Chief of Staff, saying some bizarre conspiratorial things. It's not against the law to believe in conspiratorial things, but I'm curious, given the precedent that Loretta Lynch, as Attorney General, when she recused herself after a tarmac meeting with former President Clinton, when the Justice Department was looking into something involving Hillary Clinton, is that a precedent Justice Thomas should follow and recuse himself on January 6 cases?
Well, I would respect his opinion on that. I don't know that he'll have the specific issue come before him about those records. That might be one where he would consider that. But look, he's a jurist who has a lot of integrity, and I think he will make that decision. I don't think that what your spouse says should recuse you from whether it's in the legislative branch or in the judicial branch. That would be a new precedent. But I do think that if a case comes before him that's exactly on point, again, as to probably records and whether they should be made available, that might be an issue where he would think about it. But look, he's going to make that decision, and he has the right to do it.
It's me now. Senator, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again.
Look, I want to talk about the confirmation hearings, but I want to ask you first about the president's remarks yesterday. There apparently were an ad lib remark about that Vladimir Putin just can't remain in power. It's actually a question I've asked many people on this show over the last month, which is, how does this end with Putin in power? So the president in many ways may be speaking what we're all thinking, but those remarks, should he have said them?
Well, look, I think the administration has made it clear that the goal of the United States is not regime change in Russia. It's defending the extraordinary people of Ukraine and helping them in their what I think is an existentially critical battle, not just for their country, but for free democracies around the world. So that's the focus right now, and I'm glad that not just the president or government, but to see the American people rally to this cause. I think that that's what's important right now.
But let me ask you that other question. How does this end with Putin in power?
I don't know. I mean, obviously, me and my colleagues have been hard at work at this and sitting with a lot of administration personnel. And I've heard it from the Secretary of Defense to some of our top diplomatic leaders that this is a very hard ending to see in any way for Putin to ultimately be, quote unquote, victorious in this. This is either going to be a short conflict, but we're already seeing the other awful potential for the Ukrainian people for this to drag on. But I don't see a real victory for him. His country is suffering extraordinarily. He is depleting critical resources from his own nation for this awful war. So I just don't see how this ends well for him.
Let me move to how you spent most of your week in the confirmation hearings for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. What did the American public learn this week?
I think that they saw an extraordinarily magnificent judge who showed what her temperament is, her grit, obviously her endurance of mind and body and soul. But I think they really got a chance, especially under a lot of Democratic questioning and some Republicans, of her mastery of the law and how she is more than qualified for this position.
You seem to leave out the sort of the circus-like stuff that the hearings turned into a little bit. And I guess that it does feel as if this process is broken. And every time we wonder, can these hearings get more partisan? You know, they get more partisan. And I'll see the finger pointing, this party started it, this party started it. Whatever it is, this system seems broken. What do we do?
Well, look, I'm not going to surrender to that conclusion in the sense of having gone through Amy Coney Barrett's nomination as well as Gorsuch's. I think there's a lot of frustration among Democrats clearly for what happened with Merrick Garland. I think that we've seen the legitimacy of the court really suffer, partly as a result of the tactics that we've seen going on in the Senate. But having gone through Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Gorsuch, I don't think that that's a simple conclusion. There were extraordinary realities in the Kavanaugh hearings that I think demanded for that to be as contentious as it was, and not just allowing it to go through without these extraordinary realities coming to the fore and being investigated. So what we saw, though, this week was, to me, outrageous and beyond the pale, and very different than what I've witnessed in my short time in the Senate, seeing 3 different confirmation hearings. And I think that what some of my colleagues did was just sad, frankly. But again, you had a justice there. You had a judge there that dealt with it in an extraordinary way and showed America who she is, despite that outrageousness of the questioning.
Considering that she's gone through confirmation hearings before that very committee, the only difference was the TV cameras. That's the only thing I can come up with.
I think you make one of the best points that pointed to the absurdity of it for me, which was she was already appointed to the D.C. Circuit Court, which many people call the second most powerful court in our land. And none of this came out. None of this behavior was evident. None of these questions, which I think, frankly, believe, given the endorsements of law enforcement, victims' rights groups, and others, really cast a shadow over the whole ridiculous line of questioning that many of my colleagues did. It's just outrageous that they didn't bring this up less than a year ago when she was going through a confirmation hearing. She's a bipartisan supported judge multiple times through the Senate, and I think people should keep that understanding clear.
The other issue involving the Supreme Court this week are these Ginny Thomas texts. There's a lot of calls that say that Justice Thomas needs to recuse himself. We saw what happened when former President Bill Clinton met then Attorney General Loretta Lynch on a tarmac. We had, at the time, the Justice Department was looking in at something Hillary Clinton. There were outrage on the right for recusal, and the Attorney General recused herself. Is this a similar situation? Should Justice Thomas follow the Loretta Lynch precedent?
I mean, let's go to the Kay Hagan precedent. She got onto the court, and year, I think it was 2010 to 2011. Out of 70-some cases, she recused herself over 20 times. Because not necessarily because she was conflicted, but because she understood that even the appearance of impropriety would delegitimize the court, and the court needs that legitimacy in this nation. So clearly Justice Thomas should have recused himself. That's not even at question here. And I think that we also have a thorough investigation to better understand exactly what has happened with the judge's wife.
Is there anything Congress can do, or is that a separation of powers issue?
I think that we have a lot of problems with separation of power issues, and I have a lot of frustrations with the Supreme Court as a whole that they have not taken better measures to police themselves.
Right.
There are ethics rules that they hold lower courts responsible for that they don't put upon themselves. And I think most of America doesn't understand that I could be a justice and I could give a paid speech in front of a group that has either a direct matter in front of the Supreme Court or has amicus briefs in front of the Supreme Court. There are a lot of ethics rules that they have not put upon themselves. They're just common sense and ultimately lead to a delegitimized court. And I think that they need to use this Thomas affair as an opportunity to change their ethics rules.
All right. Susan, the comment, the ad lib heard round the world, literally. Walking it back, saying it, everybody seems to agree was not the right thing to say at the moment, but everybody's thinking it.
Well, true, though a Washington gaffe, as we were saying, where you accidentally say what everyone already agrees is true, but distracting. What are we talking about today? Not the impassioned defense of democracy that the president delivered, but his final 9 words, where he seemed to be calling for regime change. Distracting, undisciplined. And we'll find out whether it is dangerous, whether it is damaging, whether it causes some kind of reaction from Moscow that would not have been coming just as a result of calling Putin a butcher and a war criminal.
Quite the walk back.
It's quite the walk back, and you have the White House really making it very clear that he was not advocating regime change. You had Secretary Blinken come out in Israel also saying that. But there's also a sense that this was a window into what President Biden really thinks and feels. This is after he was holding refugee children. This is after he has met with all these people. And this is after he called President Putin a butcher and a dictator. So in some ways, the logical conclusion, apart from, of course, official U.S. policy, would be the average person thinking, of course, he should not be in power. That said, it is distracting, as Susan said, because now the White House and Republicans, you see Rob Portman calling it a mistake and others jumping on the idea that he made a gaffe.
I'm going to dissent. I'm not sure I would have walked it back. He's a war criminal. He's slaughtering innocent men, women, and children. He illegally invaded Ukraine, and he has got command and control of nuclear weapons. Such a person should not remain in power.
So he's lost his legitimacy, in your mind?
More than lost his legitimacy. And at most, I would have modified the statement by saying it's not a statement of our policy, it's just simply a statement of fact. But, you know, I'd like to see us at some point get to a place where we're not constantly disclaiming the line over which we will not cross. And he said it, you know, presidents every once in a while do say things that ad lib. Reagan was famous
Evil
for this.
empire, right?
Evil empire.
That rattled their cages, right?
The bombing starts in 5 minutes, remember that?
Yeah.
So it was a statement of fact. Virtually everyone agrees. Everyone in the Western world agrees.
Yeah, I think everything the secretary says about Vladimir Putin is correct. I mean, clearly, he shouldn't be in power. It's one thing to say something true. It's another thing to wonder whether it was wise to say it. And this does, as Senator Portman points out, play right into Russian propaganda about the U.S., about the West, about NATO. You know, they have long made the argument that NATO is an offensive alliance that represents a threat to Vladimir Putin, represents a threat to Russian sovereignty. And the U.S. has said, no, that's not what we're about. This seems to, I think, feed that. And that's a concern. It also has a domestic effect. If you look at the number of times that President Biden has had to walk back things on this trip, 3 significant statements on this trip alone, and then you go back further and talk about his comment about a minor incursion. He has said things repeatedly that show, I think, the lack of discipline that some people had about concerns about President Biden or Joe Biden as a candidate.
And, you know, that may be one reason you have that incredible 71% number in your new poll that Americans do not have confidence in President Biden
I was surprised
to handle the situation.
By the size of that number.
That includes some of his supporters. That includes a fair number of Democrats. And the idea that White House officials, first anonymously and then the Secretary of State, have to come back and clean something up, I think reinforces the idea of, does the president Can we trust him to respond in a competent way to this war?
Of course, never happened during the Trump administration.
Well, it's particularly concerning when you think about
I
the
think
fact
we're numb to it, by the way, as a public these days. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, it's particularly concerning when you look at that 71% number and think that this was the president who ran on the idea that he was going to come with the A-team, he was going to come with all this experience, and now Americans are saying we're not confident in your policies. I think it was also interesting that in this poll you saw the domestic politics at play when it comes to thinking of who do people blame for the inflation and prices. They're not blaming Russia, they're blaming President Biden's policies. That also is something that is in some ways concerning to White House officials.
Well, I looked up the 1942 midterms didn't go well for FDR and the Democrats, for what it's worth. We are sometimes always about our pocketbook, Jay.
Yes, and as my friend, the late Andy Kohut, used to say, when it comes to polls, with all due respect to NBC, it depends on how you ask the question. If you ask Americans the binary choice between the economy, i.e. my wallet, versus something else, they're almost always going to say the economy is more important.
Yeah, and yet the president's focus actually has to be on the war, Steve.
It does. I mean, it has to be on the war, and I think part of the reason that he's struggling on the economy is, one, we're not seeing any improvement, and two, he's not willing to do the kinds of things that I think both with respect to the war and the economy that might actually help. I mean, if you talk about an all-in energy policy that would address some of the things that we're seeing come out of Russia and potentially forestall some of the inflation, he could make the case, but I don't think his base will let him.
Look, I want to bring up that you brought up the poll numbers and President Biden on the who do you blame on inflation. I just want to put it out here because, you know, the most generous way you could look at it, Susan, is, well, only 38% blame President Biden, and a majority blame something else. But that's about all you can do. What's interesting is that only 6% blame the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that was a specific thing the president said.
Well, and of course, inflation was becoming a problem before Russia invaded Ukraine, although it's clearly jacked up gas prices and had some other effects. But this is of great concern to the White House. You know, 3 of the last 4 presidents have lost control of the House of Representatives in their first midterm election. And is there anybody in Washington who doesn't think that's going to happen in November?
Well, it's funny, and Yamiche, I'm going to put up our generic ballot test here. And the public's going to look at it. You'll see 46-44, Republicans up by 2. Oh, that's a coin flip. This is the first time we've had Republicans leading on the generic ballot in our polls since September of 2014, 8 years ago. There's always a little bit of a Democratic average because there's more Democrats are more packed in some districts here. This is a huge red flag.
It's a huge red flag, and it is coupled with the idea that people are blaming President Biden's policies for inflation. It's coupled with the idea that Americans are still very, very concerned about how much they're paying for so many other things, not just gas. And that also is, I think, part of the reason why when you ask people right now, they're essentially saying that Republicans are the ones who they trust with the economy. That's going to be a hard thing for Democrats to overcome and to message about.
Yeah, well, in this gas issue, it's a regressive tax because it impacts people harder, farther down the socioeconomic ladder. As we go to break, we want to remember Madeleine Albright, who died on Wednesday. Hagen, what did we observe this week?
What we saw this week, if you talk to critics of the Republicans, is really Republicans leaning in on QAnon conspiracy theories and using the thing that they thought would land both for their own political futures, but also for sort of the cameras in the room and try to attack Judge Jackson on her sentencing. If you look, there have been a number of fact checks that say she is in the mainstream of sentencing here. We also saw, I should say, if we back up, 233 years, a black woman sitting, being a nominee for Supreme Court and being poised and answering questions that were not really related to her work as a judge, but more the partisan politics.
What'd you observe?
Chuck, I believe Supreme Court nomination hearings have become a national embarrassment. I watch these and I'm embarrassed for our country. I'm embarrassed for the nominee. You take a sitting federal judge who's a very serious, intelligent person, and you throw that person in the middle of a circus. I can just see that, and I'm referring to both Ketanji Brown Jackson and Amy Coney Barrett. You can just see the looks on their face. They're thinking to themselves, I can't wait to get across the street with the adults, and I'll never do this again. It's become a national embarrassment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Josh Hawley was pushing child pornography questions because he's appealing to QAnon, but it's very clear that Republicans have a problem with conspiracy theories.
25% of Republicans identify with these QAnon beliefs that essentially says all of us here at this table are some part of some child pedophile.
I think a
ring.
majority of Republicans reject QAnon. I think they reject a lot of these election conspiracies. But it's clear that the base of the Republican Party, there's a strain that believes in this stuff. And if you go to Josh Hawley's website right now, he's hawking a mug that has a picture of him raising his fist on January 6th to the protesters before the riot that day. If you look at what he said January 4th, when he was asked about whether President Trump was going to be remaining president, he said, well, we'll have to see what happens on January 6th. That's clearly playing to a conspiracy mindset. And if you look at things like Kevin McCarthy not going after Marjorie Taylor Greene, leader of the House Republicans, not going after Marjorie Taylor Greene, not going after Paul Gosar, who went to a conference led by an open racist, but training their fire on Liz Cheney, who is fighting the people who are amplifying these conspiracy theories. I do think it tells you a lot about the problems with the Republican Party.
Susan?
Hey, the John Birch Society was extremist. QAnon is something entirely different. QAnon believes that there is a Satan-worshipping cult of child pedophiles running the country.
Yeah.
That is beyond crazy. And the idea that 1 out of 4 Republicans say they endorse or believe some of that theory is shocking to me.
And the idea that you saw 2024 hopefuls leaning into that, though, is shocking, but also not surprising because they were, in some ways, you could see the political commercials almost being made in real time.
I got to quickly, we don't have a lot of time. Justice Thomas, do we think he'll recuse himself to January 6th case?
Supreme Court justices are very isolated. They make their own choices on these issues. We're approaching the Ginny Thomas issue like an appearance issue, the appearance of somehow a taint. More significant as a lawyer is the possibility that some of her texts, and I don't know this to be true, some of those texts could have been in that pile from the National Archives that Justice Thomas had to rule on, in which cases his spouse has a direct interest in the case.
It is the appearance, though, that also is a problem. We need black robes, folks, not red and blue. Anyway, that's all we have for today.